James sat at a table draped in crisp ivory linen, his fingers tracing the rim of an untouched whiskey glass, the amber liquid catching the soft glow of the chandeliers above. The wedding reception of his best friend Mark was in full swing, a vibrant tapestry of laughter, music, and clinking glasses. The grand estate, nestled in the rolling hills outside Syracuse, New York, was a vision of elegance. Its ballroom, with towering windows and gold-trimmed walls, shimmered under crystal chandeliers, hosting 300 guests dressed in their finest. James's girlfriend, Emily, had been by his side earlier, her emerald dress shimmering as she moved through the crowd, her auburn hair cascading in loose waves. Her laughter had filled the air as she chatted with old college friends, her warmth drawing smiles from everyone. But now, as James scanned the bustling room, she was nowhere to be seen. Neither was his younger brother, Luke. Mark and Sarah's wedding was the event of the season, a celebration planned with meticulous care. Beyond the ballroom's windows, manicured gardens stretched into the twilight, their paths lined with fairy lights that twinkled like fireflies. The air carried the scent of roses and freshly cut grass, a reminder of the care poured into every detail. James, at 30, had been thrilled to stand as a groomsman. He and Mark had been inseparable since high school, sharing late-night pizza runs, debates over the Buffalo Bills, and dreams of starting their own businesses. Bringing Emily felt like a step forward, a chance to show her off to his closest friends. They'd been together for 2 years, their relationship built on quiet, meaningful moments. Lazy Sundays reading novels by the fireplace, long drives along Lake Ontario, her teasing him about his inability to cook anything beyond scrambled eggs. James had begun to imagine a future, a small house in Rochester, a backyard for barbecues, maybe even kids someday, their laughter filling the home. Luke, 4 years younger at 26, was the family's spark of chaos. With his tousled dark hair and a grin that could disarm anyone, he had a way of stealing the spotlight. He'd arrived at the wedding in a tailored charcoal suit, his tie already askew by the cocktail hour, his charm in overdrive. James had watched him work the room, regaling guests with stories, a misadventure hitchhiking in California, a night sneaking into a sold-out concert in Buffalo. Emily had laughed at his tales, her eyes bright as Luke gestured animatedly, his hands painting the air. James hadn't thought much of it at the time. Emily was outgoing, her laugh a melody that had always warmed his heart, and Luke was... Luke. The brother who could talk his way out of a speeding ticket, who never took life as seriously as James did, who always seemed to skate through with a wink and a smile. As the evening deepened, the band shifted to a slow jazz number, and couples filled the dance floor, swaying to the soulful strains of At Last. James's mother, Diane, approached, her silver hair swept into an elegant updo, her navy dress understated yet striking. At 58, she was the heart of the family, the one who remembered every anniversary, baked cookies for school fundraisers, and mediated squabbles between her sons with a patience that seemed boundless. "James, have you seen Luke?" she asked, her brow furrowing slightly. "He promised to give a toast after the cake cutting, but I haven't seen him in a while." James shrugged, forcing a casual tone despite the unease creeping into his chest. "Probably off charming some bridesmaid with his surfing stories," he said, but the words felt hollow. Luke was notorious for disappearing at family events, often with a drink in hand and a new audience for his tales. But Emily's absence tugged at him, a quiet worry he couldn't shake. He set his whiskey down, the glass cool against his palm, and stood. "I'll go look for him," he said. Diane's eyes softened, catching the shift in his mood. She'd always had a knack for reading her sons, from the scraped knees of childhood to the heartaches of adulthood. "I'll come with you," she said, her voice gentle but resolute, as if sensing this was more than a missing toast. They wove through the crowd past tables piled with half-eaten slices of vanilla cake and bouquets of white roses, their petals soft under the chandelier light. James checked the bar where a bartender poured martinis with a flourish, and the lounge area, where older guests swapped stories of their own wedding days, their voices warm with nostalgia. No Luke. No Emily. The knot in James's stomach tightened, a silent dread spreading like ink in water. Outside, the night air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of jasmine from the gardens. The stone paths, lined with glowing lanterns, wound through neatly trimmed hedges and blooming flower beds. Diane stayed close, her heels clicking softly, her presence a steady anchor. "Maybe they're just getting some air," she offered, but her tone lacked conviction, as if she too felt the weight of something unspoken. Then they heard it, Emily's laugh, light and melodic, drifting from the direction of the marble fountain at the garden's edge. James's steps slowed, his heart thudding in his chest. That laugh had been his comfort through countless moments. Late-night talks over wine, her teasing him about his terrible taste in sci-fi movies. But now it was paired with Luke's voice, low and playful, the tone he used when he was trying to impress. Diane's hand found James's arm, a silent gesture of support, her fingers warm against his sleeve. They rounded a tall hedge, and there they were. Emily stood by the fountain, her dress catching the moonlight, the emerald fabric shimmering like a jewel. She was looking up at Luke, her face soft, her eyes bright with something James hadn't seen in a while. Luke stood closer than he should have, his hand resting lightly on her waist, his fingers brushing the curve of her dress. She laughed again, and Luke reached up, tucking a strand of her auburn hair behind her ear with a tenderness that made James' chest ache. They hadn't noticed James or Diane, too lost in their own world, the fountain's gentle trickle a soft backdrop to their moment. James froze, the world narrowing to that single, shattering image. The music from the ballroom, the chatter of guests, the clink of glasses, it all faded, leaving only the sound of his own heartbeat, loud and unsteady. Diane's grip tightened, but she stayed silent, her own shock mirroring his, her breath catching in her throat. Emily glanced over, her eyes widening as she saw them. Her smile vanished, replaced by a flush of guilt that colored her cheeks. She stepped back, her hands twisting nervously, the hem of her dress brushing the stone path. "James," she said, her voice trembling, barely audible over the fountain. It's not what it looks like." Luke turned, his expression infuriatingly casual, as if they'd just bumped into each other at a coffee shop. "Hey, man," he said, his tone light, almost flippant. "We were just catching up, talking about old times." James' throat closed, words trapped behind a wall of hurt and disbelief. He wanted to shout, to demand answers, to shake Luke until he explained why he'd do this, why he'd cross that line. But his voice wouldn't come, his mouth dry, his chest tight. Diane stepped forward, her composure a stark contrast to the storm raging in James' heart. "Luke," she said, her voice low and edged with a quiet fury, "go inside, now." Luke hesitated, his eyes flicking between James and Emily, a flicker of defiance in his gaze. For a moment, it seemed he might argue. But then he shrugged, stuffed his hands in his pockets, and sauntered back toward the ballroom, his stride too relaxed, too careless for the moment. Emily stayed by the fountain, her gaze fixed on the ground, her hands still fidgeting with her dress. "James, I'm so sorry," she started, her voice barely above a whisper. "We were just talking and—" "Don't!" James cut her off, his voice raw, barely audible. The word felt like it had been ripped from him, heavy with the weight of betrayal. He turned, his legs moving on autopilot, and headed back toward the venue, the fairy lights blurring in his vision. Diane followed, her silence heavy with understanding, her hand hovering near his shoulder, but not touching, as if she knew he needed space. Back in the ballroom, the party carried on, oblivious to the fracture in James's world. Couples twirled on the dance floor, their laughter ringing out as the band played an upbeat swing tune. Mark and Sarah shared a kiss near the cake table, their faces radiant, the crowd cheering. James found a quiet corner near a tall window, the glass cool against his palm as he stared out at the darkened gardens, the fairy lights now distant specks. Diane sat beside him, her presence a small comfort in the chaos of his thoughts. "Talk to me, honey," she said, her voice soft but insistent, her eyes searching his. "What do you need right now?" James shook his head, his throat tight, his mind a tangle of hurt and confusion. "I don't know, Mom," he said, his voice hollow, barely above a whisper. I can't believe this is happening. Not her. Not him." Diane nodded, her lips pressed into a thin line, her own heart aching for her son. She glanced across the room, where Luke had rejoined the party, laughing with a group of guests as if nothing had happened. His ease, his ability to slip back into the celebration, stung almost as much as the betrayal itself. "I'll talk to him later," Diane said, her tone resolute, her eyes narrowing slightly. "But you're my priority right now, James." James managed a small nod, but his thoughts were spiraling. He thought of Emily, the way she'd curl up against him during movie nights, her head resting on his shoulder, her laughter filling their small apartment. The way she'd tease him about his burnt pancakes, but eat them anyway, dousing them in syrup. The plans they'd made for a summer trip to the Adirondacks, hiking trails and camping under the stars. Had it all been a lie? Had she been pulling away, and he'd missed the signs? And Luke, his brother, the one he'd shared a bedroom with as kids, who'd tagged along on fishing trips with their dad, who'd always been there, for better or worse. They'd fought, sure, but they'd always had each other's backs. How could Luke do this? How could he stand there, by the fountain, touching her like that, knowing what it would do to James? As the reception began to wind down, James's father, Robert, approached. At 62, Robert was a man of quiet strength, his face weathered from years working as a carpenter, his blue eyes sharp but kind. He'd been mingling with old friends, swapping stories about the Bills' latest season, and reminiscing about his own wedding to Diane decades ago. But he'd noticed James's withdrawal, the way he'd retreated to the edge of the room. "You look like you've seen a ghost, son," he said, his voice gruff but warm, his hand resting lightly on the back of a chair. "What's going on?" James forced a smile, the effort exhausting, his jaw tight. "Just tired, Dad," he lied, not ready to unravel the mess of emotions in front of his father, not yet. Robert studied him, his gaze steady, his years of fatherhood telling him there was more to it. He'd always been the one to fix things. Broken furniture, leaky pipes, even the occasional family argument with his quiet, steady presence. But this wasn't something he could hammer back into place. "You know I'm here," he said, clapping a hand on James's shoulder, his grip firm but gentle. "Always." The rest of the night passed in a blur of music and farewells. Emily tried to approach James once, her eyes pleading, her hands twisting the hem of her dress. "James, can we talk?" she asked, her voice small, almost lost in the din of the crowd. He shook his head, his jaw clenched, and walked away, joining a group of guests he barely knew to avoid her. Luke kept his distance, his usual swagger dimmed, though he still managed to laugh and joke with others, his charm a mask James couldn't bear to look at. Diane and Robert exchanged worried glances across the room, sensing the tension, but not yet knowing the full scope of what had happened. They'd always prided themselves on their close-knit family, but tonight, something felt broken. As the guests began to leave, the family gathered to see Mark and Sarah off. The couple stood by the entrance, radiant despite the late hour, waving as friends and family cheered, some tossing rose petals. James stood stiffly, his arms crossed, avoiding Emily's gaze. She lingered nearby, her expression torn, her eyes darting to him but finding no welcome. Luke stood at the edge of the group, his hands in his pockets, his eyes avoiding James's, his usual confidence replaced by something quieter, almost guarded. The drive back to their home in Rochester was heavy with silence. Diane sat in the front seat next to Robert, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her gaze fixed on the road ahead. James stared out the back window, the passing streetlights blurring into streaks of gold and amber, his reflection a ghostly shadow in the glass. Luke had claimed a ride with a friend, avoiding the family car entirely. No one pressed him on it, though Diane's lips tightened at the mention, her maternal instincts bristling. When they reached their modest two-story house, the porch light casting a warm glow over the front yard, Diane turned to James in the dim living room. The familiar creak of the floorboards, the faint scent of her lavender candles, it should have been comforting, but tonight it felt stifling. "We'll figure this out," she said, her voice steady despite the worry etched into her face, her eyes searching his for a sign of hope. "We're family, James. We always find a way through." James wanted to believe her, to cling to the certainty in her voice, the promise of a family that could weather any storm. But as he climbed the stairs to his old bedroom, the same one he'd shared with Luke as kids, the image of Emily and Luke by the fountain played on a relentless loop. Her laugh, his touch, the ease between them, it cut deeper than he could have imagined, a wound that throbbed with every heartbeat. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling, the familiar cracks in the plaster doing little to soothe him. The memories of his life with Emily, the bond with his brother, the trust he'd taken for granted, it all felt like it was slipping away, leaving him adrift. How could his family heal from this? How could he face Emily? Or worse, Luke again? Sleep came in fits and starts, haunted by the memory of a wedding that had shattered his world, the pieces too jagged to fit back together. The morning after Mark's wedding, the Thompson house in Rochester was wrapped in a heavy silence, the kind that lingers after a storm has passed but left its mark. Sunlight streamed through the kitchen curtains, casting delicate patterns across the oak table where James sat, his hands cupped around a mug of coffee that had long gone cold. Sleep had eluded him. The image of Emily and Luke by the fountain seared into his mind, replaying in a relentless loop. Diane, his mother, moved quietly in the kitchen, her knife slicing through apples for a pie, with a rhythm that was usually comforting, but today felt mechanical. Robert, his father, sat in the living room, the Sunday newspaper spread open on his lap, though his eyes kept drifting toward James, worry etched into his weathered face. Luke hadn't come home last night, sending a brief text to Diane that he was staying at a friend's place in Syracuse. The excuse rang hollow, but no one had the energy to press him on it. James stared into his coffee, the steam long gone, his thoughts a tangled mess of hurt, anger, and questions without answers. How long had Emily and Luke been growing close behind his back? Had Emily been pulling away, her laughter with him less frequent, her touches less warm, and he'd been too caught up in their routine to notice? And Luke, his brother, the one he'd taught to ride a bike, the one he'd covered for when he snuck out as a teenager. How could he do this? The betrayal cut deeper than James could have imagined, a wound that throbbed with every heartbeat. He wanted to scream, to demand answers, but the weight of it all pinned him to his chair, silent and still. Diane glanced at him, her silver hair catching the light, her face lined with a mother's worry. At 58, she was the family's anchor, the one who'd patched scraped knees, mediated sibling rivalries, and kept the holidays warm with her cooking and care. Today, though, her usual warmth was tempered by a quiet resolve. She set the knife down, wiped her hands on her floral apron, and sat across from James. "Honey," she said, her voice soft but steady, "you need to eat something. There's oatmeal on the stove, and I can make you some toast if you'd rather." James shook his head, his voice low, almost a whisper. "Not hungry, Mom." He appreciated her effort, the way she always tried to mend broken things with food or kind words. But no amount of oatmeal could fill the hollow ache in his chest. Diane sighed, her fingers tracing the edge of the table, a habit she fell into when she was thinking hard. "I know you're hurting, James," she said, her eyes searching his. "I saw what happened last night, and I'm as shocked as you are. Emily and Luke. It's a betrayal, plain and simple. But we're a family, and we'll get through this. We need to talk about it, together." James's jaw tightened, a flicker of anger breaking through his numbness. "Talk about what?" he said, his voice sharper than he intended. "Emily made her choice. Luke made his. What's left to say?" Diane's lips pressed into a thin line, but she didn't flinch. She knew her eldest son well, his quiet strength, his tendency to retreat when wounded, his need for time to process. She'd seen him like this before, after a high school girlfriend dumped him before prom. But this was different. This wasn't just a broken heart. This was a fracture in the family she'd spent decades building. "I'm not saying it's easy," she said, her tone gentle but firm. "But we can't let this tear us apart. Luke's your brother, and he stabbed me in the back," James cut in, his eyes flashing with a mix of hurt and fury. He stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the linoleum floor, and grabbed his mug, dumping the cold coffee into the sink with a splash. "I'm going for a walk," he said, his voice tight, and headed for the door, grabbing his jacket from the hook. Diane watched him go, her heart heavy, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Robert appeared in the kitchen doorway, his flannel shirt rumpled, his face creased with concern. "Give him time, Di," he said, his voice gruff but kind, his years as a father tempering his words. "He's got a lot to carry right now." "I know," Diane said, her voice barely above a whisper, her eyes fixed on the door James had closed behind him. "But I'm worried about both of them. Luke, too, he's not as carefree as he wants us to think." Robert nodded, leaning against the doorframe, his hands in his pockets. At 62, he was a man of quiet strength, a carpenter who'd built their home with his own hands and fixed countless things over the years. Leaky faucets, creaky stairs, even the occasional family argument. But this wasn't a loose hinge or a cracked table. This was a wound in his family, and he felt helpless, a rare and unsettling feeling. "What do we do then?" he asked, his voice low. Diane exhaled, her shoulders sagging slightly. "We listen," she said. "We love them, and we don't let them give up on each other, no matter how hard it gets." Outside, James walked the familiar streets of their Rochester suburb, the June air crisp and carrying the faint scent of blooming lilacs. The neighborhood was a snapshot of his childhood. Red brick houses with neatly trimmed lawns, kids riding bikes in lazy circles, the distant bark of a dog chasing a squirrel. He and Luke had grown up here, racing down these sidewalks on skateboards, building forts in the backyard, dreaming of adventures beyond the quiet streets. Those memories, once warm, now felt tainted, colored by the betrayal he couldn't shake. He passed the small park where he and Emily had spent countless afternoons, her head resting on his lap as they read novels or talked about their dreams. She wanted to open a bookstore. He wanted to start a tech company. The memory stung, sharp and sudden, and he quickened his pace, as if he could outrun the pain. His phone buzzed in his pocket, and he pulled it out, his stomach twisting at the thought of it being Emily. It was a text from Mark, his best friend, the groom whose wedding now felt like a turning point in all the wrong ways. "Hey man, you okay? You seemed off last night. Call me if you need to talk." James stared at the message, a wave of gratitude mixing with his reluctance to share. Mark had always been there, through college breakups and job rejections, but this was too raw, too messy. He typed a quick reply, "Thanks, just tired. Talk soon," and pocketed the phone, his fingers lingering on the cool metal. By noon, James returned home, his anger dulled but not gone, replaced by a heavy exhaustion that settled into his bones. Diane was in the living room, knitting a scarf she'd started months ago, though her needles moved slower than usual, her thoughts clearly elsewhere. Robert was outside, tinkering with the lawnmower in the garage, a task he turned to when he needed to think or avoid the tension indoors. James sank onto the couch, the familiar creak of the springs grounding him slightly. The silence between him and his mother was heavy but not uncomfortable, a shared understanding that words couldn't fix everything. "I'm sorry I snapped earlier," James said finally, his voice low, his gaze fixed on the worn carpet beneath his feet. Diane set her knitting down, her eyes softening, the lines around them deepening with a mother's love. "You don't need to apologize," she said, her voice warm. "You're allowed to feel what you feel, James. I just hate seeing you like this, carrying all this hurt." James nodded, his throat tight, a lump forming that he couldn't swallow. "I keep replaying it," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Her laugh, the way he touched her hair, it's like I didn't know either of them. Not really. Diane leaned forward, her hands clasped, her voice gentle but steady. "You know them, James. Emily's been part of our lives for 2 years. She sat at our table, laughed at your dad's terrible jokes, helped me plant tulips in the garden. And Luke's your brother, the one who used to follow you everywhere, who still looks up to you even if he doesn't say it. They're human, and humans make mistakes. I'm not excusing what they did. It was wrong, and it hurt you deeply. But I know there's more to this than what we saw by that fountain." James looked at her, his eyes searching hers for some anchor in the storm. "What if there isn't?" he said, his voice raw. "What if this is who they are?" Diane reached out, her hand resting lightly on his, her touch warm and steady. "Then we'll face that, too," she said. "But I don't believe that's the whole story. Not yet." Before James could respond, the front door creaked open, and Luke stepped inside, his presence like a sudden shift in the air. He looked rough, his suit from the wedding replaced by faded jeans and a wrinkled t-shirt, his dark hair messy, his eyes shadowed with fatigue. Diane stood, her expression a mix of relief and sternness, her maternal instincts kicking into gear. "Luke," she said, her voice calm but authoritative. "We need to talk. All of us, right now." Luke's gaze flicked to James, then dropped to the floor, his usual confidence nowhere in sight. "Yeah, okay," he said, his voice quieter than James had heard in years. He dropped into an armchair across from the couch, his hands clasped tightly in his lap, his knuckles pale. James tensed, his fists clenching, his body braced for a fight, but he stayed silent, waiting. Diane sat back down, her posture straight, her voice steady like a judge in a courtroom. "What happened last night was wrong," she said, her eyes moving between her sons. "Luke, you owe your brother an explanation, an honest one. And James, you deserve to hear it. We're not leaving this room until we start sorting this out, even if it's just a start." Luke ran a hand through his hair, his shoulders hunched, his gaze fixed on the coffee table. "I didn't mean for it to happen," he said, his voice low, almost hesitant. "We were just talking, catching up. Emily was upset about something, and I was trying to cheer her up. It got out of hand." James's eyes narrowed, a spark of anger flaring in his chest. "Out of hand?" he said, his voice sharp, cutting through the room. "You had your hands on her, Luke. You were touching her like she wasn't mine. Don't act like it was nothing." Luke flinched, his jaw tightening, but he didn't look away this time. "It wasn't nothing," he admitted, his voice steadier now. "But it wasn't planned, James. I swear, I didn't set out to hurt you." James let out a bitter laugh, the sound harsh in the quiet room. "You didn't set out to hurt me? You're my brother, Luke. You knew exactly what you were doing, and you did it anyway." Diane raised a hand, her voice firm, cutting through the rising tension. "Enough, both of you. James, let him speak. Luke, be honest. No excuses, no half-truths." Luke exhaled, his shoulders slumping, his hands unclenching slightly. "Emily and we've always gotten along," he said, his voice low, almost confessional. "She's easy to talk to, you know? Last night she was upset about you two. She said you'd been talking about moving in together, maybe getting engaged, and it scared her. She felt like things were moving too fast, and she didn't know how to tell you. I told her she should talk to you, be straight with you. But she kept saying she was afraid of hurting you. We kept talking, and I don't know. One thing led to another, and I crossed a line. I shouldn't have. I'm sorry, James. I mean it." James stared at him, his anger warring with a flicker of doubt, a crack in the wall of his certainty. Emily had been upset? About their future? He thought back to the past few months, the way her smiles had seemed forced at times, the way their conversations about moving in together had dwindled, her silences longer than before. Had he missed the signs? Had he pushed too hard, dreaming of a life she wasn't ready for? "You're saying this is my fault," he said, his voice low, dangerous, his eyes locked on Luke's. "No," Luke said quickly, shaking his head, his eyes wide with urgency. "It's not your fault, James. It's mine. I should have walked away, told her to go find you. I didn't, and I messed up. I'm sorry." Diane watched them, her heart aching for both her sons. She'd seen them fight before, over toys as kids, over who got the car as teenagers, but this was different. This was a wound that wouldn't heal with a quick apology or a shared pizza. "James," she said gently, her voice pulling him back from the edge. "Do you want to say anything?" James shook his head, his throat tight, his mind a storm of emotions he couldn't sort. "Not right now," he said, standing abruptly, the movement sharp. "I need air." He grabbed his jacket and left, the door closing softly behind him, a stark contrast to the turmoil inside him. Luke looked at Diane, his eyes pleading, a vulnerability there that she hadn't seen in years. "Mom, I didn't mean to," he started, but she raised a hand, her expression softening but still firm. "I know, Luke," she said, her voice steady. "But you hurt your brother. Deeply. You need to make this right. And it's going to take more than words. It's going to take time and effort and owning what you did." Luke nodded, his gaze dropping to the floor, his hands clenching again. Diane sighed, picking up her knitting but not resuming, her fingers resting on the soft yarn. She thought of the family she'd built, the years of love and sacrifice, the laughter that had filled this house. How had it come to this? How could she guide her sons through a betrayal that threatened to unravel them all? James walked to a nearby coffee shop, the familiar bustle of Rochester's downtown grounding him slightly. The shop was cozy, with mismatched chairs and the rich aroma of roasted beans. He ordered a black coffee and sat by the window, watching the world pass. Couples holding hands, parents pushing strollers, students with backpacks slung over one shoulder. His phone buzzed again, this time with a voicemail from Emily. He hesitated, his thumb hovering over the play button, then pressed it, her voice filling his ear like a ghost from another life. "James, I'm so sorry," she said, her voice thick with tears breaking on every other word. "I never meant to hurt you. What happened with Luke? It was a mistake, a stupid mistake. Please, can we talk? I owe you an explanation, and I want to make this right." He deleted the message, his heart twisting, a mix of anger and longing he couldn't untangle. Part of him wanted to hear her out, to understand why she'd turned to Luke, why she hadn't come to him with her fears. But the hurt was too raw, the image of them together too vivid, burned into his memory like a brand. He sipped his coffee, the bitterness matching his mood, and wondered if he'd ever be able to trust again, if the pieces of his heart could ever fit back together. Back at the house, Diane and Robert sat in the kitchen, their voices low, the weight of the morning pressing on them. "Luke's got some growing up to do," Robert said, his voice gruff, his hands wrapped around a mug of tea. "He's always been reckless, but this is something else." Diane nodded, her eyes sad, her fingers tracing the rim of her own mug. "He's not as carefree as he pretends, Rob," she said. "Luke's always looked up to James, even if he doesn't show it. This is eating at him too, in his own way." Robert grunted, his skepticism clear, but he didn't argue. "And James?" he asked, his voice softer now. "He's carrying this like it's the end of the world." "It is his world," Diane said, her voice quiet but firm. Emily was his future, or so he thought, and Luke was his family, the one constant he could always count on. He's lost both in one night, or at least it feels that way. Robert nodded, his hands tightening around his mug, his carpenter's fingers calloused but steady. "What do we do then?" he asked, his voice heavy with the weight of a father who wanted to fix what was broken but didn't know how. "We listen," Diane said, her eyes meeting his, a quiet determination there. "We love them, both of them, and we don't let them give up on each other no matter how hard it gets. We've been through tough times before. Your layoff, my surgery, their fights as kids. We'll get through this, too." That evening, James returned home, his steps heavy, his face drawn with exhaustion. Diane was setting the table for dinner, the aroma of roast beef and mashed potatoes filling the air, a small attempt at normalcy. Robert looked up from his newspaper, offering a small, encouraging smile. "Dinner's almost ready," Diane said, her eyes warm but cautious, watching James closely. James nodded, sinking into a chair at the table, the familiar creak of the wood grounding him slightly. Luke joined them halfway through the meal, his presence a quiet addition to the tension, his eyes fixed on his plate, his usual chatter absent. The family ate in near silence, the clink of forks and the occasional request to pass the salt a stark contrast to their usual lively dinners, filled with stories and laughter. After dinner, Diane cleared her throat, her hands folded on the table, her voice steady but carrying the weight of her resolve. "We're not done talking," she said, her eyes moving between James and Luke, then to Robert, who nodded in silent support. "This family doesn't run from hard things. We face them together, even when it hurts. We're going to keep talking, keep trying, until we find a way through this." James looked at her, his heart heavy but stirred by her words, a faint glimmer of hope breaking through the fog of his pain. He didn't know if he could forgive Luke, or if he could ever look at Emily without seeing her by that fountain, or if his family could truly heal from this betrayal. But for now, he was willing to stay, to listen, to try. The road ahead was long and uncertain, but with Diane's quiet strength guiding them, he felt a small spark of possibility, that maybe, just maybe, they could find a way to mend what had been broken. The days after the strained family dinner in the Thompson household unfolded like a fragile ceasefire, each moment laced with an unspoken tension that hovered between healing and breaking. James moved through the house with a quiet heaviness, his steps soft, his words sparse, as if speaking too loudly might shatter the delicate balance. He'd taken to spending long hours at the Rochester Public Library, a grand old building with high ceilings and the comforting scent of aged books, where he buried himself in work emails or flipped through novels without truly reading them. It was a refuge from the chaos in his heart, a way to dodge the relentless image of Emily and Luke by the fountain at Mark's wedding. Emily's voicemails accumulated on his phone, each one a soft, tearful plea for a conversation he wasn't ready to face. Luke, meanwhile, kept his distance, his usual spark dimmed, his presence in the house fleeting, gone before breakfast, back after dinner, slipping in and out like a ghost. Diane and Robert watched their sons with a mix of hope and worry, their hearts clinging to the belief that their family could mend, though the path forward felt shrouded in fog. By Wednesday, 3 days after the wedding, Diane decided the silence had gone on long enough. She found James in the backyard, sitting on the weathered wooden bench beneath the sprawling maple tree where he and Luke had once carved their initials with a pocket knife, the summer sun casting dappled shadows across his face. His laptop sat open on his lap, the screen dark, his eyes fixed on the horizon where the neighborhood's red brick houses met the clear June sky. "James," Diane said, settling beside him, her navy cardigan soft against the rough wood, her voice gentle but carrying a mother's resolve. "We can't keep living like this. You're hurting, Luke's hurting, and it's tearing this family apart. We need to face this, all of us, head on." James exhaled, his shoulders sagging under the weight of her words, his fingers tracing the faint scars of their childhood carvings on the bench. "I don't know how, Mom," he said, his voice raw, roughened by sleepless nights and endless questions. "Every time I think about talking to Emily or Luke, I see them by that fountain, her laughing, him touching her, and it's like a knife twisting in my chest. I don't know how to move past that." Diane nodded, her silver hair catching the sunlight, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her knuckles pale. "I know it hurts, honey," she said, her voice steady, though her eyes glistened with unshed tears. "What they did was wrong, and it cut you deep. But you can't heal by running from it. Emily's been calling, leaving messages every day. Have you listened to any of them?" James shook his head, his jaw tightening, a muscle twitching in his cheek. "I can't," he said, his voice low, almost a whisper. "Not yet. What's she going to say that changes anything? That she didn't mean it, that it was a mistake? It doesn't erase what I saw." "Maybe it doesn't," Diane admitted, her tone measured, her years of mothering tempering her words. "But maybe it gives you a piece of the puzzle. You won't know until you hear her out. And Luke, he's your brother, James. He made a terrible mistake, a selfish one, but he's still the boy who used to follow you around the neighborhood, who'd beg to play catch with you even when you wanted to be alone. Don't give up on him yet. Don't give up on this family." James looked at her, his hazel eyes searching hers for some anchor in the storm that had upended his life. "How do you do it, Mom?" he asked, his voice quieter now, almost childlike in its vulnerability. "How do you keep believing in us when we mess up like this, when we hurt each other?" Diane's lips curved into a small, wistful smile, the lines around her eyes deepening with a love that had weathered decades. "Because I'm your mother," she said simply, her voice warm, unwavering. "I've seen you and Luke at your best, your graduation, the time you fixed the roof with your dad. the way you'd read to Luke when he was scared at night. And I've seen you at your worst, your fights, your stubborn streaks, your mistakes. I know there's more good in you than bad, in both of you. Families aren't perfect, James. They're messy and they break sometimes. But they can be rebuilt if you're willing to pick up the pieces and try. Her words settled into James's heart, heavy but grounding, like stones in a riverbed. He wasn't ready to forgive, not Emily, not Luke, but the idea of trying, of not letting this betrayal define his family forever, felt like a small, tentative step forward. That evening, he sat in his old bedroom, the walls still adorned with faded posters of Star Wars and the Buffalo Bills, relics of a simpler time. He picked up his phone, his thumb hovering over Emily's latest voicemail, his heart pounding. He pressed play, and her voice filled the room, soft and trembling but resolute. "James, I know I hurt you, and I hate myself for it," she said, her words thick with tears. "I wasn't honest with you about how I was feeling, and I made a mistake with Luke. A stupid, selfish mistake. I want to explain face to face. Please give me a chance to make this right." James stared at the phone, his thumb poised over the delete button, but he didn't press it. Instead, he set the phone down, his chest tight with a mix of anger and longing. Diane's words echoed in his mind. "You won't know until you hear her out." He didn't know if he could trust Emily again, if he could look at her without seeing Luke's hand on her waist. But the thought of closing the door forever felt like a loss he wasn't ready to accept. The next morning, James texted Emily, agreeing to meet at their favorite coffee shop in downtown Rochester, a cozy spot with mismatched chairs, exposed brick walls, and the rich aroma of roasted beans. He arrived early, his nerves jangling, and took a seat by the window, watching the bustle of the city, students with backpacks, couples strolling hand in hand, a street musician strumming a guitar. Emily arrived a few minutes later, her auburn hair pulled back in a loose ponytail, her face pale but composed. She wore a simple sweater and jeans, a far cry from the emerald dress that had shimmered at the wedding. Her eyes, red-rimmed but steady, met his as she sat across from him, her hands wrapped around a steaming mug of tea. "Thank you for coming," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, her fingers trembling slightly. James leaned back in his chair, his posture stiff, his hands clasped tightly in his lap to keep them from shaking. "I'm here," he said, his voice neutral, though his heart raced. "Say what you need to say." Emily took a deep breath, her eyes dropping to her mug for a moment before meeting his again, a mix of hope and fear in her gaze. "I'm so sorry, James," she began, her voice trembling but clear, each word deliberate. "What happened with Luke was a mistake. A stupid, selfish mistake that I'll regret for the rest of my life. I was overwhelmed. You've been talking about moving in together, about getting engaged someday, about our future, and I got scared. I love you, James, I do, but I wasn't sure I was ready for that next step. And I didn't know how to tell you. I should have been honest, should have come to you, but instead, I let myself get caught up in the moment with Luke. He was there, listening when I was falling apart, and I let it go too far. It wasn't about him, not really. It was about me being weak." James listened, his chest tight, the memory of her laughter with Luke cutting through him like a blade. Her words were raw, unfiltered, and they stirred a storm of emotions. Anger, hurt, but also a flicker of the love they'd shared for 2 years. "You could have told me," he said, his voice low, controlled, though it trembled at the edges. "You could have said you were scared, Emily. We could have talked, worked through it. Instead, you turned to my brother of all people." Emily's eyes filled with tears, one slipping down her cheek, but she didn't look away. "I know," she said, her voice breaking. "I was wrong, James. I was weak and I hurt you, and I'll carry that guilt forever. I don't expect you to forgive me, not right away, maybe not ever, but I want to try to make this right. I want us to work if you'll give me a chance. I'm willing to do whatever it takes, counseling, time, anything." James studied her, the woman he'd loved through lazy Sundays, road trips, quiet nights cooking dinner together in their small apartment. Her honesty, painful as it was, cracked the wall he'd built around his heart. He didn't know if he could rebuild that trust, if he could ever look at her without seeing that night. But her willingness to face her mistake gave him pause. "I need time," he said finally, his voice steady but heavy, his eyes holding hers. "I don't know what I want right now, Emily. I don't know if I can get past this, but I'll think about it." Emily nodded, another tear falling, but a small, relieved smile touched her lips. "That's all I can ask for," she said, her voice soft. "Thank you, James. Thank you for listening." He left the coffee shop, his mind a whirlwind of emotions, but a small weight lifted from his shoulders. Hearing Emily out hadn't erased the pain, hadn't mended the fracture in his heart, but it had given him something to hold on to, a possibility, however faint, that they could find a way forward, even if it looked different from the future he'd once imagined. Back at home, Diane was in the kitchen, her hands busy rolling out dough for biscuits, the rhythmic motion a small comfort in the uncertainty of the past few days. She looked up as James entered, her eyes searching his face, her flour-dusted hands pausing. "How did it go?" she asked, her voice gentle, though her worry was clear. James shrugged, sinking into a chair at the kitchen table, the familiar scent of baking grounding him slightly. "She apologized," he said, his voice low, his gaze fixed on the wood grain of the table. "Said she was scared about our future, about moving too fast. She messed up with Luke, and she knows it. I don't know if I can trust her again, Mom, but I'm glad I went, glad I listened." Diane nodded, a small smile breaking through her worry, her eyes warm with pride. "That's a start, honey," she said, resuming her rolling, the dough flattening under her steady hands. "It's not about fixing everything today. It's about taking one step at a time, being open to the possibility of healing." That evening, Luke appeared in the living room, his presence tentative, his usual swagger replaced by a quiet uncertainty. He'd been avoiding James, staying out late, or locking himself in his room, his charm tucked away like a coat he couldn't wear. Now he stood in the doorway, his hands stuffed in the pockets of his jeans, his dark hair falling into his eyes. "Can we talk?" he asked, his voice low, almost hesitant, a far cry from the confident brother James had always known. James tensed, his instinct to walk away warring with Diane's words about not giving up on family. He nodded, gesturing to the couch, his posture stiff. "Fine," he said, his tone guarded, his heart braced for another wave of pain. "Talk." Luke sat, his elbows resting on his knees, his gaze fixed on the worn coffee table, its surface scarred from years of family life. "I've been a lousy brother," he said, his voice quiet but steady, each word deliberate. "I messed up, James. I knew you loved Emily, knew how much she meant to you, and I still let things go too far that night. I was caught up in the moment, in her being upset, and I didn't think about you. I didn't think about how it would hurt you. That's on me, and I'm sorry." James studied him, the brother he'd grown up with, through backyard games, shared secrets, fights over the last slice of pizza. Luke's words were sincere, his vulnerability raw, but the hurt was still there, sharp and unyielding. "Why her, Luke?" James asked, his voice breaking slightly, his eyes locked on his brother's. "Of all people, why Emily? You knew what she was to me." Luke exhaled, running a hand through his hair, his shoulders hunching, as if the question weighed him down. "It wasn't about her," Not really, he said, his voice low, almost confessional. I've always felt like I'm chasing you, James. You've got your life together. A good job, a steady relationship, plans for the future. I'm still bouncing around, working odd jobs, never sticking anywhere long. That night, talking to Emily, it felt like I was someone who mattered for once, someone she could turn to. It was stupid, and it was selfish, and I hurt you. I'm sorry, James. I'll do whatever it takes to make this right, even if it takes years. James listened, his anger softening. Not gone, but tempered by the glimpse into Luke's heart, a side his brother rarely showed. He'd always seen Luke as the carefree one, the charmer who sailed through life with a grin, never letting anything stick. But now he saw something else. Uncertainty, a need to prove himself, a struggle James hadn't noticed before. It didn't erase the betrayal, didn't make the image of Luke and Emily vanish, but it gave James a new lens, a reminder that his brother was human, flawed, and struggling too. I don't know if I can forgive you yet, James said, his voice steady but softer now, his eyes holding Luke's. It's going to take time, a lot of time. But I don't want to lose you either. Not completely. Luke nodded, his eyes bright with unshed tears, a rare vulnerability that made him look younger, like the kid who'd once followed James everywhere. I'll take that, he said, his voice thick. I'll keep trying, James. I promise I'll show up, however long it takes. Diane, who'd been listening from the kitchen, her hands still dusted with flour, felt a weight lift from her heart, though she knew the road ahead was long and winding. She joined them in the living room, Robert trailing behind, his flannel shirt rumpled, his quiet presence a steady anchor in the storm. This is what families do, Diane said, her voice warm but firm, her eyes moving between her sons. We fight, we hurt, we make mistakes, big ones sometimes, but we don't give up on each other. We keep showing up, keep trying, even when it's hard. Over the next few weeks, the Thompsons began to rebuild, step by tentative step, like piecing together a shattered vase, knowing the cracks would always show, but hoping it could hold water again. James and Emily started talking more, not as a couple, but as two people trying to untangle what had gone wrong. Their conversations were awkward, laced with pain and caution, but they were honest, each word a small bridge over the chasm between them. James found himself slowly opening to the possibility of forgiveness, though trust remained a distant, fragile thing, something to be earned with time and effort. He wasn't sure if they could be what they once were, but he wasn't ready to close the door entirely. Not yet. Luke, meanwhile, took a job at a local bookstore in Rochester, a small but meaningful step toward stability. He'd always loved books, though he'd never stayed in one place long enough to build a life around them. The job grounded him, gave him a routine, and he made a point to check in with James, not pushing, not forcing, but showing up in small ways. He'd help with yard work on weekends, raking leaves or trimming hedges, his chatter light but genuine. He'd bring home a six-pack of James's favorite craft beer, and they'd sit on the porch, talking about the Bills' latest game or old high school pranks, steering clear of the wedding night, but rebuilding a connection, however fragile. It wasn't the easy camaraderie of their past, but it was something, a foundation to build on. Diane and Robert watched their sons with cautious hope, their hearts lighter but still braced for setbacks. They hosted a family dinner one Sunday, the dining room table laden with roast chicken, creamy mashed potatoes, and Diane's famous apple pie, its cinnamon aroma filling the house. The conversation was tentative at first, the clink of forks and the occasional request to pass the gravy filling the silences. But as the evening wore on, Laughter crept in, soft at first, then louder. Stories of past Thanksgivings when Luke had dropped the turkey, James's high school obsession with Star Wars costumes, Robert's terrible attempt at teaching the boys to fish. It wasn't the seamless warmth of their past, but it was a start, a reminder of the love that still bound them, stubborn and enduring. After dinner, James lingered at the table, his coffee cup warm in his hands, his eyes tracing the familiar grain of the wood. Diane sat across from him, her knitting in her lap, her needles still for once, her face soft with a quiet pride. "You're doing good, James," she said, her voice warm. "It's not easy what you're doing, talking to Emily, giving Luke a chance. I'm proud of you." James managed a small smile, the first genuine one in days. "Thanks, Mom," he said, his voice low. "I don't know where this is going, but I'm trying. For you, for Dad, for me." Diane reached across the table, her hand resting lightly on his, her touch a steady anchor. "That's all we can do," she said. "Try and keep trying. That's what makes a family." That night, James lay awake in his old bedroom, the house quiet around him, the familiar creaks of the floorboards a small comfort in the dark. The pain of the wedding night hadn't vanished. It still lingered. A dull ache that flared at unexpected moments, like when he saw a couple holding hands or heard a song that reminded him of Emily. But the ache was softer now, less sharp, less all-consuming. He thought of Emily, of their tentative conversations, of the possibility of a future that might look different but wasn't entirely lost. He thought of Luke, his brother, flawed and struggling but trying, showing up in ways that mattered. And he thought of Diane and Robert, their quiet strength, their unwavering belief in their family, even when it faltered. The road to healing was long, winding, and uncertain. But for the first time since that night by the fountain, James felt like he could walk it, one step at a time. He wasn't alone. His family was there, imperfect but enduring. Their love a light that refused to go out, guiding him through the darkness towards something new, something worth building.